Not for now. Right now, the only thing that mattered was escape. The whooshing wind past his ears confirmed Harry's speed, yet he still felt it wasn't enough. Never before had he longed so desperately for his flying broomstick. There's another one, Potter. As Harry burst from a tomb-like chamber, Malfoy suddenly appeared around a corner. The dazed expression on Malfoy's face and the words he shouted sent Harry into full-blown panic. Chapter 65. The expected failure. You're lying, Malfoy. Harry tried to keep his tone calm, not like an argument, but it still sounded almost like a roar. I just came from that way. Malfoy, there's nothing there except a small water channel. You're trying to scare me. Under normal circumstances, Malfoy would probably have drawn his wand to retaliate. But now, he showed no irritation, only desperate sobbing. A chained corpse climbed out of the water. I saw it. Having said that, Malfoy collapsed in exhaustion against the rounded arch of the small tomb chamber, whispering in despair, Brain wants to kill us, Potter. We're all going to die. Nonsense. Harry ground out through clenched teeth. Mr. Brain is an investigator sent by the Board of Governors and the Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts. The headmaster knows everything happening here, and Professor Snape is right outside. Harry argued against Malfoy's wild conjecture, but at least one fact was clear. There was probably a similar moving corpse in the section he had entered. He just hadn't noticed it. It was the piece of wood. Thinking carefully, Harry realized that the chained corpse Malfoy mentioned was likely the floating piece of wood in the middle of the water channel. Stepping on it had woken it from its eternal rest. Now, the situation before Harry was dire. The path ahead and behind was blocked by two moving corpses that appeared capable of biting. He and Malfoy were trapped in the middle. In about 30 seconds, they would have to confront the corpses head-on, and his only ally, Malfoy, looked as if he had already given up resisting. Damn it! Harry dashed to Malfoy's side, dragging him into the small tomb chamber. Malfoy made no attempt to resist, just trembled and muttered, We're done for, over and over. I can't, I have to do something. The faint rustling of movement and the sharp clinking of chains against the floor grew steadily louder. Harry paced anxiously within the cramped tomb, racking his brain for any decent way to defend himself. The best strategy, he decided, was to block the arched entrances at both ends of the tomb with large stones. The two undead, though menacing, didn't seem particularly strong, and if he could seal the room, he and Malfoy might just survive. But he wasn't Professor McGonagall, able to flick her wand and transform a beetle into a teapot with effortless grace. Harry's thoughts raced, but the corpses were about to give him the time to devise a perfect plan. Soon, they rounded the corner, one after the other, coming into view, no more than 30 feet from the small room. Petrificus totalis! With death closing in, Harry abandoned his hesitation and relied on instinct. Without a second thought, he flung a spell at the corpse whose swollen face was crisscrossed with fine cracks, clad in prison garb, hands and feet shackled by chains. It was the first time Harry had cast this spell himself. He'd seen Hermione use it on Neville the previous year, leaving him immobilized for hours like a statue. He hoped his version would be just as effective. Unfortunately, it failed. The chained corpse staggered slightly, but was not restrained at all. Expelliarmus! Harry tried again on the female corpse. The disarming charm was the only useful thing he'd learned from Professor Lockhart's dueling lessons, ironically taught by Snape. A brilliant red beam shot from his wand, striking the creature squarely in the chest. The spell was powerful enough to force it back several steps, but it still wasn't enough. Once stabilized, the female corpse advanced toward the room again. 2 failures in a row left Harry nearly in despair. Malfoy, leaning against the wall, had even closed his eyes as if quietly awaiting something to snap his neck. What could he do? Sweat dripped in great beads down Harry's flushed face, red as a boiled lobster. He began to understand what Professor Brain had said in his office the night before. Power is power. No emotion, however extreme, could instantly give one the strength to overcome fear. At most, it could fuel the determination to seek power. Think, Malfoy. There has to be a way to stop them from getting closer. Life and death hung in the balance. Harry could no longer scold Malfoy for his pitiful state. He shouted in desperation, hoping for inspiration. We're doomed, Potter. Malfoy's tremulous voice finally stirred a reaction. He struggled upright, tears welling in his eyes. No spell can defeat the dead. Harry's two green eyes shone again with resolute light, hardened by fear as he faced the two undead now only 10 feet from the front and back doors. Listen carefully, Malfoy. Don't ask why. I don't even know why I'm doing this myself. After a quick assessment, Harry fixed his gaze on the chained corpse, panting heavily. I'll try a trip jinx to knock down this one with the chains. If it fails, I'll charge it and shove it aside. While it's biting at me, you slip past and go get Professor Snape before I run out of air. Malfoy froze, staring at Harry as if seeing him for the first time. Harry gave him no chance to question him. Raising his wand, his youthful face radiated fearless determination. Wait, Potter, why? Enough, Draco, and you too, Potter. You can put your wands down. Before Malfoy could finish, a calm, authoritative voice echoed through the narrow tomb. As soon as that voice rang out, the two shadowy corpses froze in place, as if they had received some signal and didn't take another step forward. By the gods, Harry had never been so relieved to see Professor Snape appear. Overcome with emotion, he even found himself giving Snape, who emerged from the wall, a small, grateful smile. Snape's expression, however, was unlike anything Harry had ever seen before. No thinly veiled smirk, no icy detachment. Instead, his face was complex, his black, bottomless eyes reflecting a hint of sorrow. Professor. Snape's unusual demeanor unnerved Harry. He tilted his head to study him and asked cautiously, "Did we fail the challenge?" Snape answered with a nasal sound, then pulled out the pre-prepared Felicis potion and roughly thrust it into Harry and Draco's hands, watching them drink it down. Almost immediately, the greenish pallor on their faces eased, the tightness in their features loosening. With the external pressure gone, a wave of exhaustion washed over them from the inside out. They teetered, nearly collapsing, but Snape's reflexes were sharp. He caught them, holding one under each arm. In the process of lifting Harry, he almost slipped and nearly dropped him. "Let's go." Finally, Snape glanced at the two shadowy corpses, which had returned to their original positions, and then passed through the wall, vanishing without a trace. By the way, how does a new book, recommended on the same list as mine, but with 1,000 or 2,000 fan points on its reader rankings, even achieve that? Chapter 66, A Night in the Infirmary. Unprecedented. Inside the infirmary, Professor McGonagall's sharp rebukes drowned out the sobbing of the young wizards, Madame Pomfrey's flustered shouting, and the efforts of the house heads to calm the students. Outside, Dumbledore and Brain stood near the infirmary doors, their expressions betraying mild discomfort as they faced McGonagall's wrath. In the corridor, many upper-year students tried to casually pass by, hoping to sneak in a few details about Professor Brain's afternoon practical defense against the dark arts class. But McGonagall's ferocious glare scared them off. Since Hogwarts was founded, we've never experienced a teaching accident this severe. Professor Brain, perhaps your unconventional methods are novel, but you must stop, unless, of course, you intend to send all the children home before the heir even makes a move. Dumbledore blinked slowly, his attention caught by a panoramic telescope mounted on the ceiling, seemingly unconcerned with McGonagall's reprimand. You see, Professor McGonagall, we implemented extensive protective measures to ensure nothing went wrong. Headmaster Dumbledore himself placed powerful restraining spells on those two corpses. No one was injured. Amostar offered a wry smile, defending himself. I only wanted to give them a chance to strengthen their courage. Do you think it's just a matter of a few scratches, Professor Brain? Professor McGonagall's eyes blazed with a terrifying light as she glared at Amostar. Don't dismiss them as mere children. How many fully grown wizards could withstand the terror of the undead? That's exactly the point, Professor McGonagall. Amostar shrugged, helplessly. No one is born a hero. If we want these children to react swiftly and effectively when facing life-threatening danger, we have to train them, cultivate their courage, and test their resolve. And with all due respect, if under such carefully controlled conditions the children cannot even handle two undead, creatures that could be neutralized with a simple spell, then tell me honestly, is Hogwarts' purpose merely to pass them through a couple of meaningless exams? Meaningless exams. McGonagall pursed her lips, her gaze sharp as a hawk's. Is that what you think, Professor Brain? Those are two exams that could decide their very fate. Well, putting that aside, perhaps your intentions are good, but I still think they're far too young. Maybe you should wait until when? Amasta countered with a smile. Wait until the fangs of danger are clamped around their necks before teaching them how to use wisdom and courage to survive. The argument was on the verge of turning into a full-blown quarrel when Dumbledore finally stepped forward. He positioned himself between McGonagall and Amasta and said pointedly, "Perhaps we should leave the decision to the children themselves. What do you think?" Due to time constraints, only half as many young witches and wizards participated in the trial that afternoon, and none of them had any clue how to deal with the undead. Many gave up almost immediately after entering the maze, crying and retracing their steps. Among those who persevered, not a single group managed to reunite like Harry and Draco had. Hermione, for instance, fell into the small water channel. As she struggled to climb back onto the overturned plank, she accidentally glimpsed a pair of pale, clouded eyes, and after a scream that pierced her ears, she promptly fainted. Daphne Greengrass, in the same group, ran in the wrong direction after being terrified by an undead falling from the ceiling, and thus failed the trial as well. Surprisingly, the most noteworthy performances came from first years Ginny Weasley and Neville Longbottom. Ginny had quickly noticed something off about the wooden plank. Using a small spell, she activated it, and upon discovering it was actually a corpse, she did not flee. Instead, she forced herself to cast a freezing spell on the riverbank, trapping the sluggish undead in the water. Unfortunately, she still didn't know how to destroy it, and ultimately failed for exceeding the time limit. Neville, who usually seemed timid, turned out to be surprisingly bold. Like Hermione, he fell into the channel, screaming in terror while wrestling with the undead. In the end, Professor Snape, his face ashen, pulled him from the water. Madame Pomfrey had just given everyone a bottle of chocolate milk, laced with a cheering potion, and the atmosphere in the infirmary had lightened considerably. Thanks to Amasta's magical contract, no one could discuss what had happened in that classroom that afternoon. What happened, too? Professor Lockhart, lying on the innermost infirmary bed with cheeks swollen like a squirrel's, kept craning his neck to ask, but Hermione steadfastly ignored him. There's no way we could handle something like that. Clearly, Hermione hadn't yet shaken off her fear. She curled up under the blanket, trembling slightly, eyes brimming with tears and filled with helplessness. Harry lay beside her, looking relatively well aside from a pale complexion. He wasn't sure how to comfort her. His empty gaze drifted toward the white ceiling as he reflected on what Malfoy had said that afternoon. Black wizard, ruthless behind the scenes. Professor Brain? What exactly did Malfoy know? Potter. Leaning against the bed across from him, Malfoy had been staring at Harry's face the entire time since they entered the infirmary. His expression was dark and sharp as he finally spoke. Have something to say, Malfoy? As the school's most obvious rival, Harry wasn't about to let a single failed collaboration thaw their long-standing enmity. Lost in thought, he instinctively gave Malfoy a sharp, exasperated eye roll. Malfoy's lips pressed tightly together, his cheeks flushing visibly, and with a resentful glare, he turned his head away. A few minutes later, though, Malfoy couldn't suppress his curiosity any longer. He stared straight at Harry's face and asked bluntly, "Why did you do that this afternoon?" Harry understood exactly what Malfoy wanted to know, but he didn't know how to answer. In that split second of life and death, his choice had been purely instinctive. Now that he had time to think, the decision seemed utterly absurd. As if joking, he had actually chosen to save Malfoy, the wizard he hated most in the school. If you're willing to tell me what you meant by those words about Professor Bran, Malfoy, maybe I can honestly explain why I made that ridiculous choice, Harry said cautiously. Potter. At that, any flicker of gratitude in Malfoy vanished completely. He bared his teeth like a cornered hyena, glaring at Harry with venom. You expect me to thank you for that trivial help? Huh? In truth, you did nothing, just like everyone else. Aha, thanks! Harry perked up, sitting upright on the bed, his gaze just as sharp. I never expected your thanks. Honestly, Malfoy, I doubt you even know what that word really means. The reader ranking suddenly jumped to 10,000, kind of baffling. Chapter 67, A New Respect. When Headmaster Dumbledore, Professor McGonagall, and Brain entered the infirmary one after another, More than half the young wizards were already distracted by the ambiguous rivalry between Harry and Draco. For them, forgetting was easier than remembering, and the pursuit of novelty and the unknown was an innate, admirable trait. Ah, Dumbledore smiled warmly at the two of them, walking to the center of the crowded hall. He glanced around at the students who still looked lively, cleared his throat, and said, "I'm truly glad not to see faces filled with gloom and despair here." McGonagall coughed sharply, displeased. Dumbledore's statement wasn't exactly objective, and a few students' eyes still flickered nervously, their expressions haunted. Just now, Professor McGonagall, Professor Brain, and I discussed whether the practical Defense Against the Dark Arts class should continue. Professor McGonagall believes that facing such dangerous dark creatures exceeds your abilities, but Professor Brain insists that danger can strike unexpectedly, and therefore training you to handle and resolve it is both urgent and necessary. Except for Madame Pomfrey muttering her disapproval against the wall, no one spoke. All eyes were fixed on the three figures in the center of the hall. "I believe the decision should be returned to you." Dumbledore's gaze softened as he looked at the students, speaking slowly to ensure everyone could hear. "What do you think? Should this somewhat radical practical method continue?" Contrary to McGonagall's expectation that students would eagerly opt out, no one immediately spoke up. They exchanged uncertain glances, but no one stepped forward to give up. "But, Headmaster Dumbledore." After a long pause, Ginny timidly raised her hand. She glanced at Professor Brain, smiling yet seemingly unconcerned by the students' choices, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "We can't just give up, can we? I mean, we all signed that contract. If we quit halfway, we'll face severe consequences." "If you're afraid of that, Miss Weasley, there's absolutely no need," Amasta explained to everyone. "Headmaster Dumbledore has the power to help you forcibly annul the contract. If anyone feels they are unable to face the dark creatures in the maze, you can request it now. Both Dumbledore and I can ensure that you won't face any punishment." This time, the atmosphere in the infirmary brightened considerably. Many students showed eager, ready-to-try expressions, but with no one willing to take the lead, no one spoke up at first. "Professor Brain." At that moment, a still shaken Hermione raised her hand. "Do you really think that's something young witches and wizards can defeat?" "Not difficult at all, Miss Granger." Amosta regarded the young witch he admired, nodding and smiling. "You are simply blinded by fear at the moment, unable to see the weakness beneath the enemy's terrifying exterior. As I understand it, Miss Granger, you, Mr. Potter, and your friend Mr. Weasley once defeated a 12-foot-tall troll together in the first-year girls' bathroom, correct?" Amasta nodded toward Hermione and across the bed, Harry. "And did you use any particularly powerful spells at that time?" "No, Professor?" Harry wasn't naive. He could tell exactly who Dumbledore had been favoring in his previous remarks. With the trust of the headmaster, Malfoy's vague accusations against Professor Brain no longer bothered him. Hearing the question, Harry instinctively answered, "Ron used a levitation charm, and I used a little trick to distract it. It was risky, but really, it didn't take much effort." Professor McGonagall proudly watched Harry and blew her nose forcefully. She seemed about to speak, but Dumbledore, clearly enjoying the moment, intervened. Amasta nodded in satisfaction, glanced at Madame Pomfrey giving Lockhart his potion, and surveyed the room full of earnest, bright-eyed students. He continued, "Who here believes that what you encountered in the maze today was harder to deal with than a troll?" The second years present remembered vividly the events of the night before the previous Halloween. Trolls were not particularly mysterious creatures. Even if they hadn't seen one in person, most young witches and wizards had read about them. Hearing Amasta's question, those who had faced the undead that afternoon furrowed their brows. Honestly, the troll was still harder to handle. "Exactly. A rampaging troll could throw me into the air, but that thing in the maze..." As the students whispered and debated, Amasta smiled gently. "It seems you understand now, yes? Despair only truly arrives when you face fear and choose to give up completely." "How remarkable, such a wise statement." Dumbledore removed his half-moon spectacles to wipe his eyes, muttering softly, "But, Professor..." Hermione, ever rational, had been inspired by Professor Brain's words, yet she still sought a more concrete answer. "We know nothing about that thing. We have no idea how to deal with it. Ah, haven't I already given you the method? Amasta winked playfully. And my hint has been quite obvious, Miss Granger. As expected, confusion spread. When had Professor Brain ever mentioned such a terrifying creature in class? The young witches and wizards muttered among themselves. Hermione frowned, carefully recalling every lesson, every word, even private conversations with Professor Brain since he became the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. Yet, no matter how she tried, insight was like moonlight hidden behind thick clouds, completely unreachable. Beside her, Harry bit his lip, looking perplexed but somehow thoughtful. I, I want to continue, Professor McGonagall. 10 minutes later, to everyone's surprise, the usually overlooked and quiet first-year Neville Longbottom was the first to raise his hand and voice his opinion. Amasta's gaze lingered curiously on the round-faced little boy. This was the second time today that Neville Longbottom had genuinely surprised him. Honestly, he hadn't expected any young wizard to actually dare to wrestle with a moving corpse. If nothing went wrong, this Longbottom was destined for greatness. Mr. Longbottom. Professor McGonagall's stern eyes bore into Neville. If your only aim is to please your grandmother, you absolutely don't need to prove yourself in such a reckless manner. McGonagall's gaze was enough to make Neville shrink inwardly, his neck sinking into his chest. Especially with Headmaster Dumbledore present, he barely had the courage to argue, muttering inaudibly under his breath. Very well, the decision now rests with the two of you. Amasta didn't wait for every student to voice their opinion. He cast a long look at Lockhart, then turned and smiled with a nod to Dumbledore and McGonagall before leaving the infirmary and heading toward his office. There were more important matters awaiting him there. Chapter 68. Ancient Memories. Exiting the infirmary, Amasta strode down the corridor toward the stairs, only to find a few of the Weasley children lingering hesitantly at the corner. They had clearly noticed Professor Brain approaching, but hadn't moved to hide, as if waiting for him. Seems bedtime is nearly upon us, Mr. Weasley and company? Amasta regarded Percy and the twins behind him, along with Ron, raising an eyebrow. Have you suddenly decided to host a little family gathering? Well, actually, Professor Brain. The rare full gathering of the Weasley children, excluding Ginny, exchanged glances. Eventually, the eldest, Percy, stepped forward to explain. Professor McGonagall wouldn't allow us into the infirmary, but we were worried about Ginny. Ah! Amasta smiled knowingly and nodded. It's only natural to worry for your family. Rest assured, your little sister is perfectly healthy. In fact, none of the students suffered any actual injuries. Madame Pomfrey has already said that they merely need to stay overnight for observation, and they'll be discharged first thing tomorrow morning. The reassurance clearly relieved the siblings, who all exhaled in unison. Ron, fortunate enough to have been scheduled for the latter half of the trials, blinked hopefully. Professor Brain, could we at least go see Ginny? Harry and Hermione are there too. Sorry, little ones. Amasta passed right through them and began descending the stairs. I think it's best to follow the doctor's orders and not disturb them. Return to your dorms and sleep. If I come back to find you all still standing here foolishly, I'm afraid Gryffindor's hopes of retaining the House Cup this year might be dashed. I actually wanted to ask Professor Brain what he prepared for the upper years practical lesson. Percy muttered regretfully, watching Brain's disappearing figure. Don't get your hopes up, Percy, one of the twins scoffed. Brain's mouth is sealed tight. We tried. Not a single word would come out of him. With their shared curiosity thwarted, the subtle rivalries among the Weasley siblings quietly surfaced. Ron shot Percy a sideways glare, disdain written plainly on his face. I'm not like you, Ron. I am the twins chorused cheekily. Prefect, of course. Go to bed, all three of you. Percy's face visibly flushed a deep red as he shouted after the departing twins and Ron, If you don't start behaving properly in the coming months, I'll write to Mother. Everything all right? As the door cracked open for a moment, Amasta caught sight of Professor Snape sitting with his hands over his face, his shoulders trembling slightly. But the peculiar display vanished the instant the door was halfway open. Moments later, Snape strode out of the office, leaving no trace of that brief vulnerability. Scared into tears by undead? That's impossible. Amasta paced to the stool in the center of the room, his gaze fixed peculiarly on the few droplets of water still clinging to the floor near its legs. He raised his eyebrows, and only once the traces of tears had vanished completely did he lift his head and let out a faint, meaningless laugh. Perhaps, before leaving Hogwarts, it was time he found a moment to speak with Professor Snape. With a flick of his wand, the curtains and drapes snapped shut. To ensure that no mischievous old wizard could spy in, Amasta drew sigils and runes in the air with his wand, one after another, powerful protective spells etching themselves into the void. From multiple dimensions, magical energy and spatial boundaries alike, his office was completely sealed off from the rest of Hogwarts. In that instant, the office felt like a solitary island floating in an endless sea. No one could locate it but Amasta himself. After a period of study, relying on his deep magical knowledge, Amasta finally digested the research on memory charms obtained from Lockhart. Confident now, he no longer needed the legendary alchemical tool, the meditation basin, to peer into the hidden secrets within memories. The glow of the fireplace and the candles was extinguished. Moonlight and starlight were blocked by Amasta's magic, plunging the office into darkness as deep as the abyss of the cosmos. In the eternal black, a faint silver light began to bleed into the void, spreading outward in ripples with a rhythm like breathing. Soon, a breathtakingly intricate galaxy unfolded before Amasta's eyes. Could this be a sequence I simply cannot remember? Amasta had waited some time for the chance to unravel this mystery. After a brief, dizzying awe, he regained his composure. The magical glow enveloping his body offered no hesitation. He plunged headfirst into the flowing silver mist. Amasta moved like a fish in the river of time, stepping lightly through forgotten memories. Scenes that had truly existed were vividly etched in his enigmatic eyes. His mind raced at full speed, his emotions rising and falling with the currents of the recollections. Do you think we can really succeed? In the pitch-black infirmary, all the young witches and wizards lay quietly in their beds. The only reason for their obedience was simple. Professor McGonagall and Professor Sprout, together with Madame Pomfrey, were personally overseeing the infirmary to ensure that no incidents occurred tonight, given the large number of first and second years gathered there. For the two professors, it was a novel experience. They huddled in the small office, the soft glow of moonlight lending warmth to their lively conversation with Madame Pomfrey. But the young witches and wizards weren't so easily subdued. While McGonagall commanded them to sleep, privately countless owls flitted through the air delivering messages. Harry's partner was not Hermione. His assigned partner lay across from him, eyes sharp and calculating, so he could only discuss safe topics with Hermione. I believe Professor Brain would not deceive us. A careful little owl fluttered into Harry's blankets, unrolled its tiny note, and revealed Hermione's delicate handwriting. But I've reviewed every lesson Professor Brain has taught, and I haven't found any mention of that creature in the maze. Frustrated, Harry crumpled the note into a ball, turned over, and closed his eyes. That evening, when Professor Brain said he had already provided a hint, Harry felt a flash of insight. He was so close to the truth, yet just that tiny bit of distance remained impossible to bridge. It was an agonizing frustration. Seeing that Harry was no longer prepared to continue the discussion, Hermione's beautiful eyes gradually clouded over. Her thoughts grew hazy. She tucked herself snugly into the blankets, preparing to rest, but despite tossing and turning for some time, sleep eluded her. The silent infirmary became a battlefield of varied snores. Hermione left only her forehead exposed, surrendering the rest of her body to the warmth of the bedding. Professor Brain, what exactly did you do before coming to Hogwarts? On that first night, Professor Brain had explained to everyone that the dark creatures in the maze were ones he had encountered on his travels. Finding them of some research value, he had brought a few back. But what kind of journey would lead someone to cross paths with such dangerous creatures? That, Hermione knew, was a question she might never have answered. With that lingering uncertainty, her eyelids gradually drooped, and she soon slipped into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, Amasta dispersed the silver mist and returned to his chair behind the desk, sinking into a long, contemplative silence. Chapter 69: Persistence and Surrender. The protective enchantments covering the office had all been withdrawn. Faint starlight filtered through the gently billowing curtains, casting mottled patterns on the dark floor. Amasta leaned back in his chair, eyes staring at the shifting shadows, exhaustion etched across his features. Before reviewing the memories, he had anticipated finding some interesting information. Yet, no matter how rich his imagination, he hadn't expected that the memories he had deleted contained such remarkable secrets. Harry Potter. After a long pause, Amasta closed his eyes, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Though unrelated to the plot, the memories beneath the dormitory floor carried significance equal to, if not greater than, the story itself. One could even call them memories that shaped the course of the future. No wonder I put such thorough protections in place back then, Amasta murmured, the wryness in his expression gradually sharpening into something more sinister. His eyes held both relief and confusion. Was I still being drawn in? But why would I go to such lengths? Is that even possible? The content of the memories explained why they existed, and why only upon returning to Hogwarts and seeing Harry Potter would their clues surface. Yet their presence raised deeper questions, ones Amasta could not yet answer. Only by following the flow of time, step by step, could he one day unveil the memory's mysterious veil. The butterfly effect, has my presence only made things more complicated? Twisting his wand between his fingers, like Amasta's gaze fell on the voodoo doll on the bookshelf. Its dragon blood candlelight faded to pale pink, nose nearly broken. He could sense that under the Dark Lord's influence, the doll would not endure much longer, which meant his own time at Hogwarts was approaching a countdown. The moment is nearly right. A faint, inexplicable chuckle escaped him as he sensed the scent of freedom. Eight-eyed spider, an extremely aggressive, social, dark creature. So far, nothing has been found that this spider refuses to eat, including human flesh. Amasta's explanation slightly tempered the excitement of the young wizards who had legally ventured to the edge of the Forbidden Forest, redirecting their attention from the wild stirrings of their own imaginations to the juvenile, eight-eyed spider behind Professor Brain. You can judge by its size that this is a creature with excellent speed and strength. Pay particular attention. The venom of an adult eight-eyed spider can immobilize even a Hungarian horntail. Amasta spoke calmly to the gathered students. However, it's not impossible to deal with. The spider's weakness is as pronounced as its strength. Compared to most magical creatures' fur or scales resisting spells, the eight-eyed spider's magical resistance is roughly equal to that of a wizard. This means that even a first-year student, if their spell strikes the spider, can defeat it. Professor Bran. Katie Bell of Gryffindor raised her hand, her voice trembling with both excitement and fear. If an eight-eyed spider bites us, will it lay eggs inside our bodies? Why can't you ask a less disgusting question, Katie? Arya complained. Clack, clack, clack. Amasta chuckled, waving his hand to lift the petrification spell. Then, addressing the eager young wizards, he commanded loudly, "Fall back 300 feet and line up." Before the eight-eyed spider rushes forward to inject venom, attempt to petrify or stun it. A friendly reminder, everyone. At this distance, the eight-eyed spider will reach you in less than 5 seconds. That means you only get 2 chances to cast a spell. You have to go all in. Understand? If you fail, you'll have to swallow the consequences yourselves, because I won't be stepping in. You should be grateful to the first and second years. I've already lowered the difficulty of this practical lesson to a level even Filch could handle. Faced with the excited young witches and wizards, the eight-eyed spider known as Despair closed its eyes as if resigned to its grim fate. This took place during the 3rd, 4th, and 5th year Defense Against the Dark Arts practical classes. Despite Professor McGonagall's forceful objections, Amasta had no choice but to cancel his original plan of using a sealed classroom to recreate the Forbidden Forest. Instead, the students would face the eight-eyed spider one-on-one, entirely unprepared. For most students, however, the challenge proved just right. They were having a blast. Those with both courage and practical skill, like the Weasley twins, Cedric from Hufflepuff, even managed to toy with the unlucky spider with ease. That evening in the Gryffindor common room, when Fred and George proudly boasted about how they'd used the Petrificus Totalis and the Blasting Curse to take out 2 of the spider's spindly legs, Ron, previously anxious about the practical lesson the next day, visibly relaxed. looking like a survivor. Better than facing anything else, really. Spiders are easy compared to that. Ron's trembling words left Harry and Hermione exchanging glances. They knew that his confidence would last only until the next defense against the dark arts class. Professor Brain would soon show Ron what it meant to face the treachery of human nature. By the way, Ron chewed on a pumpkin pasty, frowning at Harry and Hermione, who had seemed distracted over the past couple of days, and asked, "You two still haven't figured it out?" At that, Harry collapsed onto the sofa while Hermione put down her transfiguration paper with a sigh. Harder than we imagined, Ron. You need to prepare yourself mentally, too. What Professor Brain said at the infirmary was inspiring, but for those of us lacking practical experience, it's not going to be easy, is it? Hermione glanced at Ron, who seemed to have resigned himself to fate, and added, "This isn't something you can fix with a simple floating charm to knock someone out." Ever since Professor Brain had given everyone another chance to opt out at the infirmary that night, the majority of students who had already encountered the undead had chosen to quit, and a significant portion of the second group preparing to enter the maze also reconsidered. Ron, in fact, had considered giving up too, but seeing Harry and Hermione persist, and even Neville spending all day by the fireplace pondering which simple spells could defeat the maze's dark creatures, Ron gritted his teeth and pressed on to protect his fragile pride. After tomorrow, Professor Brain has scheduled the next practical lesson for next Thursday. I just hope I can come up with some plan by then. Hermione frowned, still uneasy, and said, "Since Professor Brain has already allowed people to quit, why can't we at least consult some reference materials?" Chapter 70, The Secret of the Eyes. By mid-March, a full week before the Easter holiday, Professor McGonagall had already told the second years that after the break, they would need to choose their elective for third-year classes. This temporarily distracted Hermione from the Defense Against the Dark Arts practical lesson. She spent the entire weekend poring over the new course list, unwilling to give up any subject. Even during the usual weekend afternoon task of helping Professor Lockhart reply to letters, she brought the course list along, hoping to glean some guidance from Professor Brain. "Interest is the best teacher, Granger," Amasta said with a smile. "Energy is limited, so you must make choices. If you're asking for my advice, I think care of magical creatures and ancient runes might be more practical." "She's already decided to sign up for every subject," Harry said cautiously. This time, Professor Brain didn't ask anyone other than Hermione to help Lorat write a reply, yet Harry still followed her into Brain's office. The reason was simple. He hoped that by talking with the professor, he might pick up some clues on how to deal with the shadow corpses. "All of them?" Amasta looked at the little witch in front of him, her brown eyes flickering with stubborn determination, and sighed. "Time might be an issue, Granger. Many of the classes overlap completely. You can't physically be in two classrooms at once." "That's not a problem, Professor Brain. Professor McGonagall gave me a good suggestion." Hermione's hand moved with practiced speed, writing fluently on the parchment. Brain's warning hadn't shaken her resolve at all. "And you, Potter?" Amasta gave up on trying to dissuade them and turned to Harry. "Divination and care of magical creatures, Professor. Ron and I chose both." Harry replied quickly, already thinking of a way to steer the conversation toward the hints Brain had mentioned back at the hospital. Amasta nodded subtly, muttering to himself, "I hear that Professor Kettleburn in care of magical creatures might retire next semester. Looks like Dumbledore will have to find replacements for two professors." Harry's mouth fell open in surprise. Even Hermione paused mid-stroke with her quill, staring at Brain. Exchanging a glance with Harry, she hesitantly asked, "Professor, do you have any plans to continue teaching?" "Heh," Amasta chuckled softly, picking up a framed photo on the desk and carefully dusting the edges. "I'm afraid you'll be disappointed, Granger Potter. Being a Hogwarts professor might be a fine job, and perhaps one day I'll choose it. But at least for the near future, I have no such plans." Hermione's expression fell. Even Harry lost, for a moment, the urgency to figure out how to combat the shadow corpses. His eyes lingered on the young, striking face in the flickering candlelight, the violet eyes deeper in color than when he first saw them. He remembered what they had learned about Brain from Hagrid at the start of the semester. Professor, Harry hesitated, curiosity getting the better of him. He asked timidly, "We heard from Hagrid about your school days. Back in your 5th year, in the Forbidden Forest, that dark witch you encountered, did you ever find out who she really was?" Amasta paused mid-dust, glancing at Harry. His smile turned enigmatic. "Good question, Potter. Honestly, I've thought about this for years. I've always wanted to understand why that woman broke into Hogwarts and tried to kill me when I was just a student, but it wasn't until a few days ago that I finally pieced it together." "Who was she?" Harry and Hermione's eyes widened, both gasping in shock. "I can't tell you just yet." Amasta lowered his gaze, smiling as he placed the frame back on the desk. Seeing the two young wizards' disappointment, he pressed his lips together, considered for a moment, and then said with a grin, "All right, as a consolation, you may ask me another question instead. I'll try my best to answer it. Of course, Potter, if your intention is to find out how to pass the practical course from me, don't bother." Harry laughed sheepishly, embarrassed that Brain had seen through his plan. He clicked his tongue regretfully, and his gaze accidentally fell on the framed photo. His brow lifted, and he looked back up into Brain's eyes. The first time Harry had entered this office, he had been intensely curious about why Brain's eyes had changed so much since his school days. With Brain willing to answer their questions now, this was a rare opportunity to finally understand. Through Harry's gaze, Amasta seemed to sense his thoughts. He blinked and chuckled softly. "All right, if you're truly curious, you're willing to tell us?" Harry asked, shyly but eagerly. "Actually, there's nothing I can't tell you, Potter." Amasta leaned back in his chair, smiling gently. "In fact, this has a bit to do with what happened on the night before Christmas in my 5th year." Hermione immediately set down her quill and sat up straight, her posture precise, as if she were back in class. "That night, there were two things that unsettled me. The first was the sudden intrusion of a dark witch into Hogwarts, and the second—" Amasta raised a hand to stop Harry, who was about to defend Dumbledore, and looked up at the cold stone ceiling, smiling as his gaze drifted into memory. "That night, Dumbledore simply cast a disarming charm, and yet I saw firsthand what it means to stand at the pinnacle of the modern magical world, to witness a truly powerful wizard. Ever since, I've been pondering one question. If, for some reason in the future, I had to confront a wizard as strong as Dumbledore, how could I ensure my survival, or even victory, against such a being?" Harry and Hermione exchanged uneasy glances. After a long pause, Harry whispered, "That was just a misunderstanding, Professor. Normally, Dumbledore wouldn't ever harm you." "Dumbledore is the greatest white wizard of our time," Amasta said, "and losing to such a wizard—" Under Professor Brain's intense, gleaming gaze, Hermione found herself at a loss for words, but she still voiced her thought. In the modern wizarding world, no one would consider it shameful to lose to Dumbledore. "My view is different, Granger," Amasta said calmly, stroking his fingers. "The first step to surpassing someone is believing with certainty that you can do it. In this world, no one is truly unbeatable. No matter how powerful a wizard, they are destined to be surpassed by those who come after. So I've never believed that wizards like Dumbledore or even the Dark Lord are invincible." Chapter 71, Magical Organs. Harry and Hermione exchanged stunned looks. Defeat Dumbledore? Honestly, even in his wildest dreams, Harry had never imagined such a thing. Could a person really accomplish that? Harry was certain that if Professor Brain's words got out, many would scoff. Yet Amasta spoke calmly, as if he were not entertaining a fanciful thought. To defeat someone, you first need to understand the gap between you and them. So, what do you think separates me from Dumbledore? Someone as learned as Dumbledore must know powerful spells that ordinary wizards have never even heard of, Hermione said sensibly. Just like the ancient magic you've taught us in class, she continued. I'm sure Dumbledore's mastery of ancient magic is beyond ordinary comprehension. Powerful spells, Amasta said, smiling without denying it. That's certainly a crucial factor. Dumbledore's magical talent is unquestionable, and he's an extremely diligent wizard. Even now, at over 100 years old, he has not stopped learning and improving. Under normal circumstances, I could never hope to have a deeper knowledge of magic than Dumbledore. That is indisputable. Ron would definitely regret missing this conversation today. Harry held his breath unconsciously, thinking that, but immediately reminded himself to stay focused. This kind of high level discussion wasn't something everyone could be lucky enough to join. However, that's not the main reason I can't surpass Dumbledore, Granger. When it comes to spell improvement, I also possess an unparalleled instinctive acuity. Even back then, having already found the path to advanced spell work, I realized that if I continued to study diligently, it wouldn't be long before spell power and versatility would no longer be obstacles to defeating a first rate wizard. If the discussion had been about how to become a knowledgeable scholar, Hermione might have had plenty of insights to share. But the question of how to become a truly powerful wizard was something she had never considered. Furrowing her brow, she looked at Professor Brain and waited silently for him to reveal the answer. Actually, it's not as complicated as it seems, Amostar explained with a smile. The key lies in the magical power within each of us. Magical power? Harry's mouth dropped open, his expression blank with confusion. Yes, Amostar nodded. Every wizard experiences a surge of magical power during childhood. This is proof of our innate talent, and the only time in our lives when our magical reserves spike dramatically. After that, our magic grows gradually and steadily as we age, accompanying us for our entire lives. In other words, the moment we die, our body holds the greatest magical potential it will ever contain. So what you're saying is your greatest disadvantage compared to Headmaster Dumbledore is the unbridgeable gap in magical reserves caused by our age difference. True to form, Hermione had grasped Professor Brain's meaning immediately, even while Harry was still reeling. Precisely, Miss Granger, Amostar said, smiling. A vast difference in magical reserves renders all techniques and tricks almost meaningless. If I don't find a way to overcome this disadvantage, then, unless Dumbledore is too old to lift his wand, there's no hope of even surviving 5 minutes in his presence, let alone defeating him. That night, when the Dark Witch appeared, Dumbledore's simple disarming charm had nearly nullified the most powerful protective spell Amostar knew. The incident had been a harsh wake-up call. From then on, he had been devising ways to compensate for his deficit, knowing that at the highest levels of wizard dueling, spells alone lose much of their effectiveness. The ultimate duel between the strongest wizards is really a contest of raw magical power, but that was not easy to overcome. Magical growth followed its own natural laws. Any attempt to force it could lead to disastrous consequences. Amostar had seen many dark wizards in the underworld attempting to increase their power by grafting magical creature blood into themselves. The results were catastrophic. Every one of them suffered horrifying physical mutations, most of which were irreversible, and their minds were often corrupted as well. Amostar agonized over this problem for a long time, but eventually devised a clever workaround. Since a wizard's natural magical growth cannot be accelerated, he created a secondary storage for magical power outside his body's normal reserves. Using alchemical principles, he developed a spell to store the excess magic produced in his daily life in his eyes. Essentially, he externalized a magical organ. When engaged in a fierce duel, the power in his eyes could continuously feed him like a built-in magical charger. Watching the two young wizards gaping at his eyes, Amostar smiled calmly. The reason my eyes changed color so dramatically is that they've been saturated with high concentrations of magic. Whenever I need it, the power in my eyes flows back into my body. If one day you see my eye color return to normal, that means a situation has arisen that requires me to exert my full strength. Incredible, Hermione said, her voice full of awe. This method is unheard of, Professor Bran. I'd bet that no wizard in centuries could have thought of this. You are truly a genius. Perhaps, but it was more out of necessity than genius, Amostar replied calmly. He didn't feel particularly proud. In fact, it was thanks to his previous life as a traveler that he came up with the idea. He had drawn inspiration from a popular anime technique called the 100 Wealth Arts, a ninja method. The principle was to seal the body's naturally produced chakra and release it when needed, granting the user a temporarily extraordinary combat ability. This spell was what allowed Amostar to move confidently in Dumbledore's presence. If an unexpected confrontation arose, it gave him the means to stand his ground, ensuring enough time to escape if necessary. However, This genius-level magic came with an undeniable drawback. Whenever Amasta exhausted the stored magic in a duel, he would have no choice but to rely on large quantities of mana-restoring potions to quickly replenish the power in his eyes. Attempting to recover naturally from his own magic would take at least a year or more before he could return to peak condition. And of course, mana-restoring potions were extremely expensive. The fees Amasta earned from his assignments mostly went to supporting the orphanage where he grew up and purchasing rare books and recent research manuscripts. He also had to set aside a significant portion for potion ingredients to brew these mana elixirs himself. As a result, although Amasta had earned a fair amount of money over the past 3 years, his lifestyle had always been tight and frugal. Second year events were winding down. The next chapter was still in the planning stage, and it would definitely diverge from the original storyline. While the previous book had collapsed after straying from the canon, strictly following the original plot in a fanfic could be equally dull. Also, support from readers would be appreciated. The current collection count hadn't even reached 10,000, which was a bit disappointing. Traces of the Spider sharing secrets is one of the most direct ways to draw people closer. After listening to Professor Brain reveal his own, Harry clearly felt a little embarrassed. He hesitated, glancing at Hermione, who seemed equally reluctant in return. "Do you two have something you'd like to share with me as well?" Amasta rose and walked to the fireplace, taking a steaming kettle from the shelf to pour himself a cup of tea. When he returned to his seat, Harry and Hermione seemed to have silently reached a consensus. "Professor Brain," Hermione began, "do you think hearing voices that others cannot hear counts as a useful talent?" Looking at Harry's hesitant expression, Amasta realized that his efforts, both intentional and not, to build rapport with them were about to pay off. Concealing his expression behind a faint wisp of a smile, he answered gently, "That depends on the circumstances, Potter. A single statement alone is not enough for me to make an accurate judgment." A suffocating silence fell. Hermione closed her mouth, and Harry's face grew increasingly uneasy. Professor Brain was one of Harry's favorite teachers, but he had not come to Hogwarts simply to teach. His primary mission was to investigate the Chamber of Secrets. If possible, Harry wanted to help him, as long as it didn't put himself, Dobby, or Hagrid at risk. Ideally, Brain would find the chamber, or the monster inside it, and the matter would end there, with no one held accountable. "The situation is this," Harry said cautiously, choosing his words carefully to make it seem as though he knew very little. "The first time I entered your office, you asked me why, on that night of Nick's Death Day party last Halloween, we had ended up on the third floor. Actually, it was because I heard a strange voice. The first time it appeared was in Professor Lockhart's office." For the next 10 minutes, Harry explained the context and sequence of events surrounding the mysterious voice. Amasta listened, expressionless, leaning back in his chair, lost in deep thought. "And you're certain that only you heard it, Mr. Potter?" Amasta asked again, not rushing to draw conclusions. "Yes, Professor Brain." Hermione nodded carefully. "Harry, Ron, and I were together. But apart from Harry, neither Ron nor I noticed anything unusual." Amasta nodded knowingly, recalling the path from the basement to the third floor. In a measured tone, under the watchful eyes of the two young wizards, he said, "If I'm not mistaken, the source of that sound was likely a snake." "A snake!" Harry exclaimed, while Hermione looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Amasta's simple deduction seemed to cut through the fog that had long clouded her mind. "That's right! It has to be Harry!" Hermione shot to her feet, cheeks flushed with excitement, her fingers trembling. "It all makes sense. Only you could have heard that sound. Naturally, Harry, because you speak parcel tongue, no one else could possibly understand what a snake's hiss means." "But," Harry interrupted, following Hermione's line of thought, "at the time, in the basement and corridor, apart from the three of us, there were only ghosts. If there really had been a snake, it couldn't have hidden itself in the walls, right, Hermione?" "Not necessarily." Harry's words made Hermione frown. She hesitated before replying. "If the snake were small enough, perhaps it could slither through the cracks in the bricks, or maybe it has a special ability to move freely through walls. After all, a normal snake wouldn't have the power to petrify anyone, Harry." Hermione's speculation was indeed plausible, but it remained just a possibility. Anything that has existed, no matter how carefully hidden, will always leave traces. Amasta stood up with a smile, clearly in high spirits now that he had real work to do. He waved his wand, gathering all the scattered letters from the floor and the table, then turned to Harry and Hermione. Let's go back to the scene. Perhaps we can find some interesting clues. The night was deep. On a Sunday evening, few young wizards wandered the castle. Most were holed up in the common rooms, finishing homework or playing wizard chess, gobstones, and other games with friends. Passing through the second floor, they saw Filch yelling at two first years, threatening to chain them up in his office if they didn't clean the muddy floor. Kind-hearted Amasta stepped in and helped the two students. No need to be so harsh on the first years, Filch. Facing the irate caretaker, who didn't dare defy a professor, Amasta smiled gently. Soon enough, Professor Sprout's mandrakes will be ready, and your Mrs. Norris will be back to full health. The trio arrived at a hallway near the entrance, leading down to the basement. The passage was pitch black, with traces of candle wax from the row of black candles Nick had set up for the anniversary feast still clinging to the floor and wall seams. I was standing right here. Even after more than 4 months, Harry remembered that night vividly. He hurried with Hermione and Professor Brand to the midpoint of the corridor, pointing at the wall. The sound came from inside the wall, traveled along the ceiling, and eventually led us to the third floor. Amasta lit his wand and let his gaze trace along the wall following Harry's directions. Finally, he nodded. It seems we need to open up this wall. Open the wall? Hermione gasped, astonished. Of course, Miss Granger. Otherwise, how could we figure out how that snake was moving inside the wall? Amasta said casually, waving his wand a few times through the air. With a few flashes of light, the solid wall split apart as easily as tofu. And when the space behind the wall was exposed, all their questions were answered. It was a pipe. Behind the stone wall, a mold-covered pipe emitted a foul stench, and if you listened closely, you could hear the sound of flowing water. I always thought the wall was solid, Harry muttered in disbelief. Now everything makes sense. Hermione's face turned pale. I can't imagine how a snake large enough to fit in here could even move. There's still much to solve, Miss Granger, Amasta said, narrowing his eyes. He jumped onto the broken wall, examining the large pipe carefully. After a moment, he held his wand in his palm. Show me the way. Chapter 73. A sense of discomfort. The wand in Amasta's palm began spinning rapidly, like a windmill, and continued without pause. What does this mean, Professor Brain? Hermione asked nervously, glancing at him with squinted eyes, hoping for an explanation. This means, Amasta said calmly, stopping his attempt and gripping his wand, as he stared at the small section of exposed pipe, that Salazar Slytherin placed numerous powerful spells on his chamber, including ones that prevent it from being located. That foils any plan I might have had to find it through magic alone. Honestly, it's quite a headache. Hogwarts Castle has stood for 1,000 years. Who knows how many times the castle's plumbing has been altered? It's even possible that the original blueprints of the castle have been lost. Harry and Hermione visibly slumped in disappointment at Amasta's words. No matter what, this was the closest they had ever been to the monster inside the chamber since the events first began. In the dim light, Harry frowned at the pipe. For some reason, ever since Professor Brain guessed that the mysterious voice he had always heard was coming from a snake, he had felt a faint sense of dissonance, as if he had forgotten something important. So what should we do now, Professor? Hermione asked, not noticing Harry's strange silence. She looked concerned. Do we need to tell Professor Dumbledore about this discovery? Not for now, Miss Granger. Amasta dismissed the suggestion without hesitation. He thought, joking aside, that while he didn't necessarily have to be the first to find the chamber, he at least had to do so before Dumbledore. Otherwise, once Dumbledore removed the magical creature inside, what could he possibly report? Amasta jumped down from the half-wall and waved his wand, restoring the wall to its original state. The pipes inside the wall are connected to the castle's entire sewage system. Unless absolutely necessary, I'd rather not crawl through each one under a bubblehead charm just to search. Over the next few days, I plan to spend more time in the library. First, to figure out exactly what species the snake in the chamber is. Second, to see if I'm lucky enough to find the original blueprints from when Hogwarts was first built. They probably won't mark the chamber itself, but maybe through subtle clues we can roughly pinpoint its location. Is there anything I can do to help, Professor Brain? Hermione asked hopefully. Of course, Miss